Hello, everybody. If you're watching us on the live stream, we are going to try this again. We had a little bit of a technical issue, new computer. Welcome to the Southern California Housing Market Update for May 3rd, 2022. My name is Stephen Meade with Domicile Real Estate for people who love houses. This is a bit of a different video for us because I have some things that I want to talk about. And the question is kind of in the air. We're hearing it from buyers. We're hearing it from sellers. We're hearing it from random people on the street. Are we in the bubble? Are we standing on the end of a precipice? What is going on? How much higher can prices, or rather monthly payments, go? I think that's really important to focus on that. Are we really standing in a market where this is the result of supply and demand and the market is where it should be? Or is this a scenario where we have overly exuberant buyers who will just buy anything for whatever price it's listed at plus $50,000? Sometimes it does feel like that. I wanted to kind of get to some data to maybe reference this. So we're going to do this in a reverse order. We're going to use a chart that we normally use towards the end of the video because I want to start off with that. And I want to kind of lead you down this path of sort of understanding where our thinking is coming from, and then we're going to go through the rest of the data and see how does that fit in with what we think is happening. So if you'll give me a second here. All right, this is the graph. This is our affordability of the median priced home indexed back to June of 2018. And I want to talk, I'm going to tell you what this graph is for a second. We've actually modified this graph in a way. So if you look back here, back to June of 2018, we're kind of calling that sort of ground zero, right? So we have everything is actually indexed back to that point, back down over here. So let's see, we got an arrow here. So June 2018, we're showing three things on this graph. We're showing our payment index, which is an index of the payment on a median priced house. So that incorporates interest rates. Our CPI index, which shows how has CPI or inflation moved. That's in the red line. And then the yellow line is our rent index. So that is looking at the rent on a median priced detached home, again, in Los Angeles and Orange counties, and to see how these match up. And what's interesting is back here in June of 2018, 19, 20, you actually see that rents and inflation tend to go pretty well together. That's hardly shocking or surprising. But housing costs were actually low in June of 2020. It was a great time to be a home buyer. Even through, as we went through 2021, we were still trailing behind. The point where things crossed over here was about March of 2021. So, and if you look here, these things really tended to move together. So you saw monthly payments were moving together, inflation was moving up, and rents were also ratcheting up. They kind of stayed for a long time at a certain point. And then when we got into 2022, so that's right about here, that's when really things started to take off on our payment index, right? And you see, I mean, just really went crazy. If you look here at our rent index, it seemed to kind of go up much more slowly, but this last spike here is actually the last 2 weeks, right? We're seeing rents are moving up, and we're actually seeing a little bit of downward movement, at least on the median home price. And we're going to show that in a graph here in a second, moving downward, and you actually see these coming together. So this is my argument, and I'm going to take this off the share because I want you to really listen to this. In my experience, home buyers make decisions based on their best alternative, especially home buyers who are not rich home buyers, right? These are people spending a substantial amount of their income on housing. They are going to look at their options, right? And if you are a person living in Southern California, you have several options for housing. One, you can rent something, right? Whether that's renting a room, renting a house, renting a condo, right? Like you can rent something. You can buy something. That's probably option number two. And the third option is you can pack your bags and try to go somewhere cheaper. So I'm going to talk about those three options just for a second. So if you rent something, right, like the rents are the rents, they're like home prices, they're like interest rates. You don't have a lot of control over this. If you are looking to move somewhere else other than California, you do have some control over that. But the bad news is Southern California is not the only housing market really that's gone crazy in the last couple of years. Like this is pretty much across the United States. Now, there's obviously isolated counterexamples, places where things have not gone up as much. I understand that those places exist, they're possibilities, but most, we'll call them desirable metropolitan areas, right? And even some not so desirable metropolitan areas have seen rather substantial housing cost increases, especially in terms of prices and rents. So, you know, if you are a person who's studying the housing market, and if you're watching this, that is you, one of the things that you start to think about here is what options do consumers have? And that really makes a big difference, because if you look back in 2006, the payment on homes took off. In that case, it was mainly because of price appreciation through that 2004, 5, and 6, and 7. It wasn't so much the interest rates. Those took off, but what didn't take off were rents. In fact, they stayed flat. They did not show any signs of following housing. And that was a very irrational example, right? And I think that set us up for disaster. But if you look here, what are we seeing? Rents were flat for a long time, and now they have started ratcheting up. We don't have quite as much data as I'd like on this, but we're seeing evidence that those rental housing prices are in fact moving up in a manner and getting closer to those purchase price housing payments. And that's important because that's a huge difference. Now, if you look at this, there's still a big gap. And as of, you know, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, there was no gap, right? Like these were appreciating at the same level, and that gap started to widen. Just to kind of give you some insight into this as well, and I'm going to go off screen share again. You know, people like to make these graphs like they are black and white, right? And that they show exactly the conclusion that they want. And I get that. You want to be clear. You want to give people sort of a clear direction. But I'm going to give you an example of why that can be the sort of path that leads you into trouble if you're trying to analyze the market. And we really have a great point here. And this is a point I've made before, but now I get to actually illustrate it. So if you look at this graph, what you see is a drastic widening gap between our rent index and our payment index. And that gap really looks like a problem, even though we see some signs that that gap is narrowing. But there's one little caveat right now. So I have a client who is purchasing a home right now, and so this is an actual real case scenario. This client was quoted for a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, just over 5%, right? And that is what we base this payment index on. It's based on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. He was also quoted 3.75% for a 7-year ARM, or adjustable rate mortgage. So the difference between that significantly closes this actual gap again between rent, and that is the reason why I don't see a cliff coming in terms of home prices. Now, I'm going to repeat this like 3 times because I think it is really important. Based on the data today, I don't see a cliff in home prices. I see the potential for an adjustment, especially if these interest rates persist. But the point that I want to make here is, you know, something does have to change when we're showing this graph, right? This gap is not sustainable. So something's got to change here at some point. Either rents need to come up to meet this, or this payment needs to find a way to go lower, or both of these things need to have happened. This is not a long-term sustainable gap. So, you know, like I said, people going to ARMs, that is functionally reducing these payments to some degree. We're seeing that happen. The other thing that, you know, we could see is, are these rents going to jump to start meeting this demand? As fewer people are in the housing market, they're all going to need places to rent, right? And if that happens, is that going to start producing rent increases in our rental market? I actually think it will. And the question is, is this enough to sort of head off price reductions in home sales? And I've talked about this a lot before. We're in a market where most sellers have a ton of equity. If they don't like the prices, a lot of would-be sellers can say, I'm not going to put my house on the market. I'm just not going to make that move right now. I don't like the rates. I don't like the prices. I'm just not going to do it. And so you have a lot of these factors really that are built into this market to keep prices propped where they are, or to adjust in some nominal manner. And by nominal, I mean 5%, absolutely less than 10%. So, in a given 12-month period, you might have a period where things dip and then interest rates dip again, and then the home prices jump back up. Like that's a very possible scenario in the market that we're going to see in the next 6 months. So, we're seeing this market start to kind of adjust to these interest rates. We're absolutely seeing fewer buyers in the market, but the way that's affecting the market is very interesting. And that is what I want to talk about now. So we're going to go back to our kind of regularly scheduled here charts. So first things first, active listings on the market. They are going up, and we have more active listings than we did a year ago. So I'm going to repeat that again. There are more active listings on the market than there were a year ago, maybe 10% more. Not huge, but definitely an improvement if you are a home buyer looking for houses, right? So this is the market reacting. Now, if we look at, I'm learning this new pointer here, so you'll have to excuse me a second. If we go to our next little chart here, our 14 days of new listings. Now, again, we are actually still below the listings we would have expected to see in this market. We're below where we were last year in terms of listings coming onto the market. So, if you add these two up, they don't add up, but they're getting better. They're getting close. And then if we look at our new escrows, this really tells the story. We have fewer homes going into escrow now than we did last year, and it is a decent number fewer. So the question is, if fewer homes are going into escrow and new listings are the same, that's why we're seeing this total number of listings going up. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. Now, if we look at our absorption rate, that too is falling. Under $1 million, which is our blue line, that is roughly high 70%, still a seller's market, but this 1 to 2 million range, yeah, that absorption rate is definitely falling a little bit. We are below 70%. The last time we saw that was in July of last year, and then it quickly bounced back to kind of around 80%. So to have a number below 80 for a long period of time, like we've kind of seen this dropping, that's unusual. That's new data. And if we look at our closed prices, remember, this is 4 to 6 weeks old, we are seeing a little bit of a dip, but remember, prices do fluctuate normally. We do regularly see dips. So it's kind of hard to draw a trend line. That dip, all that's really done though is, of course, it's taken us back a month in where we were prices a month ago. But that, if you'll notice, that's in our entry level and in our median. But guess where we're not seeing any kind of a dip? In that 75th percentile. So that's another clue of which buyers are affected most by this. Unsurprisingly, it is the buyers who are more likely to get a loan for a higher percentage of purchase price. As you go up in purchase price, people put larger and larger down payments. Now, if we look at our still active after 14 days on the market, this looks at all the listings that came on the market in the last 2 weeks, all of them, and says how many are still left. We have seen this number steadily go up, right? Even our under $1 million, this is kind of a high point, have not seen that since last summer. And also again, on our 1 to 2 million, this is a sign that this market is a little bit weaker. But if we look at our list to close ratio, interestingly enough, that has not yet slipped. So that's telling us something, right? That's telling us something about which properties are selling. And that's a really important lesson in this market. Because when we go back to days on market, right? Now, if based on what I've just told you, right? Inventory is up, absorption rate is down, more of those homes that just came on the market to stay on the market, we would expect that days on market to be going up, but it's not. And there's a very plausible reason for that. This is days on market for new contracts. And what I think is very interesting about that is that means we've kind of got a tale of two types of listings, the haves and the have-nots. There are the desirable listings. Those are going under contract just as quickly as ever, right? They are going into escrow. And then there's everybody else. And that market is very different. So, if you're a buyer and you're writing offers on houses, you really are trying to determine not just what price should I offer, but is this one of those high desirability listings where I'm going to have to be competitive and put my best foot forward? Or is this one of those listings where maybe the seller miscalculated and this market is softer than they expected, and I can get in there and actually have some opportunity? And, if I were just a person playing the market, that's what I do. I look for the ones that feel like they have opportunity on them. Now, if you're a particular buyer, like an architectural buyer, you might not have that luxury just yet, right? Because all of the properties you're going after in that high desirability category. This is that graph that we showed again, and it's this gap, right, between this rent index and this payment index. That is the gap that cannot exist in the long run, right? Because if it does, people will stop buying. That gap will close in some way. So we're really looking for two things to happen to close that gap. Either the payment on housing goes down, and that can happen because people do a different loan type, interest rates come down, or prices fall, or do rents go up to sort of meet that pricing level? And it looks like we are seeing some rental movement. And is that going to help close this gap? And if it does, that is going to mean we have a very stable housing market once this gap is closed up again. But I think until it is, we're all waiting to see, are interest rates going to go up further? Or have we reached a plateau? I don't know, and I don't think anybody can really predict that. 3 months ago, the National Association of Realtors was predicting rates would go to 4.5%, and that would be it, or 4% at the most. Clearly, that isn't how it has worked out. And I think, the Fed seems adamant on controlling inflation. And the best way they know how to do that is to spike short-term interest rates. So it's very interesting to see how the market is going to react. At the same time, recession talk is usually good for interest rates. So it's really anybody's guess where we end up. I think there's some bond traders who have some definite opinions about that. You can probably find their videos on YouTube too and watch them. But it's this gap is really what we're talking about when we're trying to determine, are we in a market that just is a function of market dynamics, or are we in a situation where buyers have gotten maybe a little overly exuberant? Being 100% honest, I think it's a little bit of both. Do I think there's a potential for some modest price decreases? Maybe, but I'm already seeing this gap starting to close. And I think if that happens, I truly believe that that's going to relieve all that pressure from the housing market, that pressure that says, why are you buying, right? If these get super out of whack, why wouldn't people just continue to rent? And I think the reason why we're seeing that buyer volume drop off, but it hasn't disappeared, is because, these rents are starting to move up. And if this gap closes, that's really going to alleviate kind of that mismatch that we see that started to develop several months ago. And in reality, in the housing market, several months is not a long period of time. In the short run, you can have these gaps. It's the long run that these gaps cannot exist. And looking at prevailing mortgage rates, here we are cresting 5%, and it looks like things have started to level out. That really is going to be a big determinant in what the next 6 months look like for our market. Alrighty, kind of a long video. I apologize for that, but I think it's useful information. I think it's information that you need if you're a buyer or seller in the market. Speaking of which, if you'd like to be a buyer or seller in this market, absolutely reach out to us. We would love to help you and lend our expertise to it to maximize value for your seller and maximize your opportunities if you are a buyer. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We will see you again real soon.